It's alright. Just be cool now. You get down. It's just sweet either way.
To me, you are the most hateful of all gods who hold Olympus. Forever quarrelling is dear to your heart. Wars and battles. Our story begins in Olympus, at the height of the Ancient Greek Pantheon, but it could be anywhere at any time. Hera, queen of Olympus, goddess of marriage and women, had a son with her older brother and husband Zeus, the king of the gods. They brought forth Ares, god of war, in personification of the primal carnage of men, not just war, the brutality of it. He would wage a war against love and unleash death. But Ares was not the only name used to invoke war, not even the first. Shortly after writing began in Egypt, the palette of Narmer was inscribed. It tells the story of the first pharaoh of a unified Egypt vanquishing his rivals. This marks the beginning of the first dynasty about 3100 BCE in the mythical, as yet undiscovered capital city of Thinis, which worshipped the Egyptian god of war on Her, the slayer of enemies. The rest, as they say, is history, and there's a lot of it. The causes of war are simple. Simple needs, simple desires, desperation and greed, all 7 deadly sins, all 4 horsemen. Some call it the devil, temptation, and evil. Bad thoughts, bad words, bad deeds. But it's actually not clear where or when what we call war first manifested. In the long prehistoric infancy of our species, large-scale conflict was likely not even possible. Contact was probably limited to fights over game, as small bands or tribes followed herds, staying close to fresh water and foraging grounds. In 2005, excavation work began in Hamukar, a large archaeological dig near the Iraqi and Turkish borders. The settlement there dates back to the 5th millennium BCE, but it was destroyed about 3500 BCE. Slings and thousands of clay bullets have been found among the ruins, possibly evidence of the earliest urban warfare discovered so far.
Ares poisoned men's hearts with jealousy and suspicion. He turned them against one another.
One of the earliest cemeteries, called Jebel Sahaba in the Nile River Valley near the border of Sudan and Egypt, dates back at least 11,600 years. Of the 61 individuals found there, 26 skeletons had arrowhead fragments near them or in some cases still embedded in them, causing speculation of a massacre. There was also evidence of healed injuries indicating persistent raids. But by this time, many other species had already conquered the world. Large-scale war efforts and coordinated tactics were being deployed at least since the emergence of ants about 140 million years ago. The Matabele ant of Comoé National Park in West Africa is engaged in an endless hunt for termites. When a scout locates the termites' feeding grounds, the colony is alerted and the fastest route is determined. Sometimes a single ant will find the fastest route, which also isn't always the shortest. The colony is somehow coordinated enough to follow this route and execute an overwhelming raid of what humans would call shock and awe. Since the termites' feeding location is always changing, the ants have to adapt with them, creating a constant game of hide and seek. That is, until the ants attack the nest itself, in which case the termite sentries guard the narrow entries while workers frantically seal off the heart of the colony.
And all of history.
And the story begins again, around 850 years before the Common Era. A man of myth and his followers establish a city of mostly male bandits. Shortly after, they throw a festival and announce it to the neighboring cities as a celebration. During the festival, the myth tells of 30 young women, all but one a virgin, who were abducted by their host and later implored to marry their abductors. The mythical man is known as Romulus, and the newly founded city was Rome. The scene becomes popular among artists and sculptors and is known as the Rape of the Sabine Women. The resulting hostilities with the surrounding tribes erupted into the invasion of Rome, which they fought back. Rome was quickly becoming a powerful force and defeated 3 neighboring tribes. It was soon on the offensive against King Titus Tatius of the Savines, fighting against the fathers of their abducted wives. Intervention finally came, according to Roman historian Livy, when the women, from the outrage on whom the war originated, with hair disheveled and garments rent, the timidity of their sex being overcome by such dreadful scenes, had the courage to throw themselves amid the flying weapons, and making a rush across to part the incensed armies and assuage their fury, imploring their fathers on the one side, their husbands on the other. A treaty was struck, and the Sabines united with the Romans as one nation. Titus Tatius ruled with Romulus until his death 5 years later, and as we all know, Rome was just getting started. Like the Spartans and Egyptians before them, the Romans had an affinity with their war god, this time known as Mars.
Wrap it up. I'll take it.
There are many other war gods and goddesses as well, such as Agasea, Agrona, Agurzil, Achoikak, Akunken, Ahulneb, Ahulain, Alala, Alazaigi, Alquam, Auki, Amphilogaia, Anahita, Anan, Anath, Andarta, Andrasta, Andractasia, Anhur, Ankt, Anuk, Apetamak, Ares, Ashtart, Asher, and Athena. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is just the A's. The longest conflict in history is the Reconquista on the Iberian Peninsula between the Christians in what is now Spain and the conquering Muslims who invaded in the year 711. It lasted 781 years, finally ending with the 10-year-long Granada War. Christian forces made a massive offensive push, recruiting farmers to swell their ranks, destroying enemy crops, and pushing the Muslims towards the sea. It ended on January 2nd, 1492, with the surrender of Islamic rule. 7 other wars or conflicts have lasted longer than 500 years, another 106 wars lasted longer than 50 years, but the god of war is insatiable, and humanity was about to manifest the most destructive incarnation the world had yet seen. In 1162, in a desolate place where food and luxury was scarce, a baby was born in exile from a disgraced family. He would go on to become a warrior and unite the Mongol tribes as Genghis Khan. His conquest was fueled by fear. He readily employed brutal tactics like spreading disease by catapulting the dead over walls. So many people died that weather patterns were disturbed and forests grew back on previously populated land. The Mongol horde trampled empires, handing down ultimatums of death or alliance. Fear spread like a plague, and the horde rode in behind it, destroying some to tame the rest. Khan would promise protection and relative normalcy in exchange for complete surrender and regular tributes. Those made subordinate became sources of income, fueling the Khan's engine of war.
The god of war.
For a brief moment in time, Genghis Khan and the Khans that followed carved out the largest empire on earth.
I will wage a war against humanity, the likes of which this world has never seen.
Perhaps the deadliest confrontation in history took place under Hulagu Khan during the siege of Baghdad in 1258, which lasted only 13 days. At the time, Baghdad was the capital of the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate. Their leader, al-Mustasim, was either overconfident or incompetent or both. When the Mongols had overcome the city's defenses, they executed al-Mustasim and massacred the people, leaving Baghdad horribly depopulated. Contemporary accounts state Mongol soldiers looted and destroyed mosques, palaces, libraries, and hospitals. The Grand Library of Baghdad, called the House of Wisdom, containing countless historical documents and books on medicine to astronomy, was destroyed. Priceless books torn apart, their leather covers used as sandals, their contents dumped into the river with the dead. It's said the Tigris ran red from the blood of philosophers and scientists and then turned black from the ink of their wisdom. The siege is considered to mark the end of the Islamic Golden Age.
You're being optimistic if you think I've reached the height of my powers.
This level of carnage would not be unleashed again in so short a time until the 20th century in World War I, and again just one generation later in World War II. The siege of Leningrad alone, which lasted from 1941 to 1944, would leave 1 million to 5.5 million dead. Then, the Battle of Stalingrad began in August 1942. It lasted into the winter and added again to the list of bloodiest battles in the history of warfare. Air raids dropped bombs on civilians as fighting devolved into close-quarter house-to-house combat. Both sides poured reinforcements into the city, and by the end, as many as 2 million were dead. After 5 months, 1 week, and 3 days of fighting, the Axis forces had exhausted their ammunition and food, finally forced to surrender in February 1943. It was a turning point in the war that began pushing the Nazis back to Berlin. Bellum omnium contra omnes. The war of all against all. In the middle of this hell on earth, in July 1942, Wonder Woman issue number 1, The Origin of Wonder Woman, is released by DC Comics. In it, for some reason, she's carrying a parchment in her outfit which tells the history of the Amazons. Of course, she loses it, and obviously someone at the Smithsonian gets it and translates it, so we all get to learn what's happening now. The story returns us to Olympus. Aphrodite is arguing with Ares over who will rule the world, men with violence and hate and war, or women with love. The argument spills over onto Earth. Women throughout the world are enslaved by Ares. Aphrodite turns the tables with a magic girdle she gives to the Amazons. The girdle is eventually stolen by Hercules, who enslaves them. Aphrodite intervenes again, granting the Amazons the power to break the chains and remain free for as long as they refuse to submit to men. Their strength lie in the bracelets they wear, as reminders of the chains that enslaved them. Away from the influence of men, they create a utopian civilization called Paradise Island. But back in the real world, on a different island, in the Pacific theater of World War II, Ares was about to transform the meaning of war and place humanity's very existence on a knife's edge.
But the difference is I no longer need an army.
On July 16, 1945, the U.S. successfully detonated the first atomic bomb in New Mexico. 9 days later, the decision to drop one on Japan was made, and Allied forces issued the Potsdam Declaration on July 26, which handed down an ultimatum of complete surrender or the inevitable and complete destruction of the Japanese armed forces, and just as inevitably, the utter devastation of the Japanese homeland. The bomb wasn't mentioned, and the ultimatum was rejected. On August 2nd, Truman and other high-profile U.S. officials boarded the USS Augusta, headed back home across the Atlantic. A group gathered in Secretary of State James Burns' cabin the first night at sea to watch a movie. It was called Wonder Man. A nightclub owner is murdered by gangsters but comes back as a ghost to haunt his killers. Truman stayed in his cabin, perhaps thinking about the explosion that was coming and the weight of his choices. He had written in his diary the day of the decision that the target will be a purely military one. It's hard to imagine he didn't know better. About 3 days later, on the other side of the world, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was going to work at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries for what was supposed to be his last day in the city. It was 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945 in Hiroshima, Japan, and an estimated 70,000 people were about to die. Yamaguchi heard a plane overhead. He looked up and saw the Enola Gay B-29 bomber, and he saw the object drop and the parachute that was attached to it. What dropped was an atomic bomb equivalent to 18,000 tons of TNT. It was more powerful than the previous largest bomb ever used in warfare by more than 1,500 times. Yamaguchi described the blast like the lightning of a huge magnesium flare. He had barely been able to dive into a ditch before the boom ruptured his eardrums, and the shock waves sucked him into the air and tossed him into a nearby potato patch. His face and forearms were badly burned, and he thought he might have fainted for a while, but he was alive. He described everything like the start of an old film before the picture begins, when the blank frames are just flashing up without any sound. The morning sun was blotted out by dust and debris and falling ash. A mushroom cloud of fire was rising over Hiroshima. He was less than 2 miles from ground zero. A mile and a half away, half a mile from ground zero, Shigeyoshi Morimoto was luckier than 95% of the others within the same blast radius. The master kite maker was part of a secret military study to use kites against American planes. Suddenly, he found himself under the rubble of his cousin's home where he was visiting, but Morimoto, his cousin, and his cousin's son all survived. He said in an interview by Robert Trumbull in 1956 that it was like a lightning flash. Then the house collapsed and we were pinned beneath the fallen ceiling and roof. When they dug themselves out, they couldn't believe the level of destruction. Every building was flattened within a mile of the explosion, and fire would soon destroy every building within a 4.5 square mile radius. Within weeks, another 70,000 would die in the aftermath. 16 hours after the explosion, a video was released of President Harry Truman revealing the existence of the atomic bomb to the world for the first time.
It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe.
Truman was actually still aboard the USS Augusta in the Atlantic Ocean. He was having lunch when a Navy captain delivered the message.
The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
Truman turned to his Secretary of State James Burns and shouted, "It's time for us to get on home." He then addressed the sailors in the mess hall, calling for attention by banging silverware against the glass. The sailors went quiet, and Truman made his announcement to an explosion of applause. Morale was soaring all over the Augusta. A sailor's quote summed it up best, saying, "I guess I'll go home sooner now." Yamaguchi was thinking about home, too. In a daze, he found a couple co-workers who also survived. After taking shelter for a night, the three began making their way toward the somehow still operational train. They trekked through a desolated city of smoldering fires, crumbled buildings, and the charred and melted corpses of the dead, all to reach the station, where he boarded a train full of other burned and bewildered passengers. Morimoto had gone back to the hotel he was staying at for work. It was badly damaged, but still standing, and 3 of his colleagues were alive. They got permission to leave the city on August 8th. The 4 men, along with Yamaguchi, were trying to get back home on the overnight train to Nagasaki.
Like Hades, I wield dominion over the dead, which allows me to unleash my own worst curse upon your people.
At least 3 trains made the 190-mile trip from Hiroshima to Nagasaki and arrived there by August 9th, the day that city would be bombed. 165 survivors from Hiroshima are thought to have traveled to Nagasaki and lived through the second explosion as well. People who experienced both attacks are called Niju Hibakusha, or twice-bombed person. Yamaguchi reported for work at Mitsubishi's Nagasaki office, and at about 11 a.m. he was giving a full report on Hiroshima. He recounted what he could, the blinding light, the deafening boom, the devastation, but his superior didn't believe it, didn't believe a single bomb could destroy an entire city. Suddenly, another white flash exploded outside. Yamaguchi dropped just seconds before office windows were shattered by the shockwave and debris blew through the room. In his panic, he thought it had followed him, but he had just survived a second atomic bombing in 3 days. He ran out of the wrecked building and past the ravaged city to get home to his wife and son. When he got there, part of his house was a pile of rubble, but they were alive and barely hurt. His wife had left to buy burn ointment for him, and she and the baby were near a tunnel when the bomb dropped. If Yamaguchi hadn't been burned in Hiroshima, his family might have been killed in Nagasaki. Morimoto, the kite maker, had just finished describing the atomic bomb to his wife when their house was suddenly flooded with the same blinding flash. He was shouting as he shoved his wife and son into their air raid shelter and pulled the heavy door shut behind him as their home was destroyed. Morimoto and his family were also uninjured, but many others were not lucky. Roughly 200,000 people died after 4 months, about half on the first day, from the effects of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It remains the only nuclear bombing used in warfare, and although Hiroshima had a sizable military garrison, most of the dead were civilians. After the immediate aftermath, people continued to die in the thousands for months from burns, radiation sickness, and injuries made even worse by illness and malnutrition.
Did your mother not warn you this is how it would turn out? That you would suffer at the wicked...
Japan surrendered to the Allies on August 15th, 6 days after Nagasaki and the Soviet Union had declared war on them. Japanese government officials signed documents on September 2nd, ending the war and beginning occupation. It is generally thought the casualties from the bombings is at or near the low estimates for casualties had the war continued on the ground. It was feared the number of dead could reach 1 million or more if the Allies invaded the Japanese homeland. Americans were also war-weary. The massive operations were expensive, and military strategists were worried about the Soviet Union expanding its influence in the East. And thus, ARES had raised the stakes again with an insidious bargain between two outcomes of mass death. The ethical and legal justifications for the bombings is still debated today.
They start these wars on their own.
But it didn't matter then. The war was over and America was celebrating, its homeland emerging nearly unscathed and a towering force on the world stage. Humanity began to rebuild, but there was little time to reflect. The full implications of what had happened were still coming into focus. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, William Leahy, once decried the use of atomic weapons as an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. But in 1947, he reported a military requirement for 400 atomic bombs.
Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
The Soviet Union detonated their own atomic test in 1949. Oppenheimer was stripped of his job and commission after expressing concerns over the devastation of future nuclear war. Despite his opposition, the U.S. had developed and tested a hydrogen bomb by 1952.
Only one of these weapons feeds me with the psychic energy of 1,000 wars.
Ordinary fission bombs, like the ones dropped on Japan, would henceforth be known as small tactical nuclear weapons, 1,000 times weaker than the new versions. By 1986, the US had more than 23,000 nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union had more than 40,000. More than 90% of the world's remaining nuclear weapons were owned by Russia and the United States at the start of 2019. Over 2,000 nuclear tests have been conducted in over a dozen locations around the world by 8 different countries. 9 countries have nuclear weapons today. When Yamaguchi's son died at 59 from cancer in 2005, Yamaguchi went public with his story. After remaining silent since his 1950s interview, he began speaking out against nuclear war. Of the estimated 165 people who experienced both attacks and lived, he became the first and only survivor to be officially recognized by the Japanese government as Hibakusha in 2009. He said he got through the many years after the bombings with poetry. A year later, in 2010, he died at the age of 93. It may seem as if the god of war, feeding constantly on the conflict in the world, is at his most powerful. In the myths and the comics, Ares had done his best throughout the years to destroy the Amazons, sending Hercules against them and sacking their island, but he also had ambitions for all humanity. Although there are 7.6 billion humans, we make up just 0.01% of all living things. In other words, humans are statistically insignificant, but have caused the loss of 83% of all wild mammals and half of plants since the dawn of civilization. The rate of lethal violence between Homo sapiens is 7 times higher than the average among 1,024 species of mammals. Now humans have amassed the potential for total annihilation.
But it has never been enough. Until you.
In 1987, Wonder Woman Volume 2 began the 6-part series. In it, Ares' plot was to spark a war between the United States and Russia, provoking World War III. In the 6th-issue Power Play, Ares was nearing victory and was only thwarted when he was finally caught in a golden lasso and forced to face the truth, that without the chaos of men, he would cease to exist, having no one to worship him.
Then you've learned nothing, have you?
However, there would be survivors in this nightmare, like the ginkgo biloba. A ginkgo tree survived in Hiroshima less than a mile from Ground Zero. It's nicknamed the Tree of Life, and it happens to be the oldest species of tree on Earth, dating back 270 million years. It also smells like vomit, helping it to survive thousands of generations of grazing animals. Along with the ginkgo tree, other survivors would probably include rats, cockroaches, ants, scorpions, flies, wasps, worms, bacteria like E. coli, amoebas, and the seemingly indestructible tardigrade. It wouldn't be the most pleasant world, but it would still be alive. And the story begins again, one more time. There was once a utopia. At least that's what outsiders had come to think. It made sense from far away. It had mostly been forgotten, cut off from the world, and for a long time no one questioned this supposed utopia. It had achieved an almost mythic paradise lost status until finally an explorer came to stay there for a while. At first it seemed the view from the outside was correct, but one day their leader died, leaving a power vacuum, and a tyrant emerged to fill it. Not all were willing to follow. A group of dissenters separated, forming a smaller group, but this did not bring peace. A member of the new group was ambushed one day without warning, beaten badly, and was never seen again. Over the next 4 years, the smaller group was picked off one by one and systematically destroyed. The victors ate the flesh and drank the blood of their victims. They celebrated over the dead with hoots and screams. The explorer was horrified. There was no mercy. But it wasn't men that did these things, not this time. These were the events observed in the jungles of Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania, from 1974 to 1978 during the Gombe Chimpanzee War. The explorer was Jane Goodall. By the end, 10 were dead or missing, and only 3 females remained. They were beaten and kidnapped, and in that way, the two groups became one again. Goodall discovered the systematic hunting strategies and aggressive nature of chimpanzees, exposing their cannibalism and taste for smaller primates. She turned conventional wisdom upside down and found it difficult to come to terms with what she saw herself. But she also observed peaceful and affectionate behaviors, intelligence, emotions, social bonds, and forced man to redefine itself or accept chimpanzees as human. Examples like this and others, like ants and termites, should teach us that we have more in common with nature than many of us may admit. Their complex social structures and fights over territory and resources are so familiar, it seems odd to consider them beneath us. In fact, ants in particular are arguably more successful and dominant than humans by a number of metrics. It's thought the total biomass of ants, the weight of all of them combined, is more than that of humans, and they certainly outnumber us. However, even among ants, war rages, and almost unnoticed, one species, the Argentine ant, Lenapithema humile, has grown into a colony so large that the sun never sets on its intercontinental empire. And they are waging what is being called the largest war ever fought in the animal kingdom in the entire history of life on Earth. The Argentine ant benefited from international travel, and it's thought sometime in the 1800s a super colony emerged in Europe. The super colony subsequently spread worldwide on its way to dominate every landmass except Antarctica. Researchers discovered when members of different super colonies on different continents were mixed together, they greeted each other as kin. However, believe it or not, a schism has split the North American super colony in two. The most active known battleground in the Argentine Empire is now a brutal civil war in San Diego, California. The average Argentine ant is just 3 millimeters tall, and yet the battle extends for miles. Along just this one war front, 30 million die every year.
I am not the god of war, Diana. I am the god of truth.
Not to be outdone, though, among humans in 2019, there were at least 29 conflicts where more than 100 people lost their lives, including 9 wars and 4 major wars in Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and the Mexican drug war.
They have always been and always will be weak.
Also in 2019, military investment worldwide was estimated at a little over 1.9 trillion.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions.
On September 10th, 2001, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced that $2.3 trillion was unaccounted for in the U.S. military budget. A day later, September 11th, that worry was forgotten. But that number had risen to $8.5 trillion by 2015. In the last 40 years, the United States military has spent $25.5 trillion. This is called the Military Industrial Complex, or MIC.
Looks like we'll have that dance after all.
The Pentagon's budget alone was $738 billion for 2020. Most of the public squabbling was over the White House getting $1.3 billion for the wall. The newest tanks are $20 million apiece. The F-22 fighter jet is $200 million apiece. It was $140 million in 2009. The latest aircraft carrier cost $13 billion.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The U.S. spent $35.4 billion on nuclear weapons in 2019, and the total for the world was $72.9 billion. It cost $18,000 to recruit just one soldier in 2007, and the average cost to maintain an active duty soldier was $99,000 per year as of 2014. Both those figures are trending up. An entry-level soldier makes just over $20,000 a year.
Lay down your arms! You're being used!
The average wait time for a VA claim is more than 4 months, and veterans have disproportionately higher suicide and homeless rates. But despite the headlines, despite the violence, despite the tragedy and chaos and potential destructive power Ares or Her or Mars or Mick could unleash on humanity at any minute, despite how things might feel right now, overall, things have gotten better and can get better if we choose it.
Friends.
Ares' path on his way to being caught in the lasso of truth began in The Princess and the Power, the first issue of Volume 2, released in 1987. It begins in the late Stone Age and tells the story of a caveman who is exiled from his tribe with his pregnant mate after he loses a hand in a failed hunt. She tries to console him, but he rejects her pity and kills her in a violent rage. Soon after, the voice of the great mother Gaia began whispering from the earth, and the caveman freezes in shock as a light flies from the woman's body into the sky. That light was the soul of the unborn daughter held back from creation, as the first woman had been murdered by a man. After many years, it was put inside a baby girl made out of clay from Paradise Island. The baby girl was given life by the Greek pantheon of goddesses named Diana. She grew up among a legion of sisters and mothers and became the champion of the Amazons, an emissary to the world of men. They would call her Wonder Woman.
Oh my God! What are we gonna do?
There's lots of other videos to watch, so join me, subscribe, like the videos you like, share the videos you love, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, thank you. You are the fuel to the fire.